Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 329. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. I got a lot to cover on today's show, but mainly talking about the threats being made to use nuclear weapons, what the White House is saying, what the Kremlin is saying. So I'll be breaking all that down. Really big show today. Please share the show. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute. Repost on the blog at antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee for the video version of the show. And then you can support the show. We get a kickback every time we make a sale through our Paloma Verde code PEACE. People tell us they love the CBD they get from Paloma Verde. Of course, I endorse their products. I've used particularly their sports cream. I find to be very helpful in relieving any kind of muscle soreness or like knee pain, back pain, stuff like that. Any kind of that I'm feeling. The sports cream works great. A lot of people telling that the soft gels are like a thing they take a couple times a day. The gummies are great for anxiety relief. They even have treats for your dogs that I've gotten feedback from people saying, hey, helps my older dog get around, helps my younger dog to be a little less maybe neurotic or anxious, things like that. So great way to help yourself, help out your pets, and help out your favorite podcast. So PalomaVerdeCBD.com, promo code PEACE. Now let's get into the show. First article I have today is from my colleague at antiwar.com, Dave DeCamp. He writes, Putin orders partial mobilization, issues nuclear threat to West. And he says, Russian President Vladimir Putin on Wednesday ordered a partial mobilization that will call up to 300,000 reservists and warned Western countries that Moscow would use nuclear weapons to defend its territory. The move marks Putin's biggest escalation of his war in Ukraine since launching the invasion on February 21st, although he is still framing his war as a special military operation. If the territorial integrity of our country is threatened, we will without a doubt use all available means to protect Russia and our people. This is not a bluff, Putin said in a televised address. The citizens of Russia can rest assured that the territorial integrity of our motherland, our independence, and our freedom will be defended. I repeat, by all the systems available to us. Those who are using nuclear blackmail against us should know that the weather vane can turn around, he said. And I'll get into maybe what that nuclear blackmail is in a minute. Putin did not specify the number of reservists that will be activated under the partial mobilization, but the Kremlin later clarified it would be 300,000, which the defense minister recommended. Putin said Russia will call up those citizens who are currently in the reserve and primarily those who served in the army and particularly military specialties. The Russian leader expressed support for referendums on joining Russia that will be held in areas under Russian control from September 23rd to 27th. So we are right in the middle of that as I am recording today on September 25th. Everybody's expecting that these four regions will vote to join Russia. They are Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Luhansk. And so Donetsk and Luhansk are, of course, the Donbass. And then those other two, I believe, are both in the south. So Putin made clear that he blames the U.S. and its allies for the current situation and said a peace deal was possible earlier in the war after Russia and Ukrainian negotiators held talks in Istanbul. He said that the U.S. He was making the details of the peace talks public for the first time after the start of the special military operation. In particular, after the Istanbul talks, Kiev representatives voiced quite positive response to our proposals. These proposals concerned, above all, ensuring Russia's security and interest. Reports in Western media and Ukrainian media have also said the deal was close after the Istanbul talks, which were held at the end of March. But according to a report from Ukrainian Pravda, former talks were quashed by UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, and we have covered that particular incident quite extensively on the show. The next article I wrote for antiwar.com on September 23rd. And this one is titled White House sent multiple threats to the Kremlin via bad channels. And I wonder if this is the threats that Putin, the blackmail threats that Putin was talking about in his speech. And so this is the Joe Biden administration has sent several warnings to Russia via bad channels regarding the possible use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine, the Washington Post reports. The White House's message to Russia had been intentionally nondescript to foster uncertainty in Moscow about what the U.S. would do if Russia deployed its ultimate weapon. The White House has sent messages several times since the war in Ukraine started, according to U.S. officials who spoke with the Post. The White House communications with Russia have been intentionally vague. The Biden administration believes non-specific threats will deter Russia through strategic ambiguity. Strategic ambiguity is an intentionally unclear policy that causes an enemy not to act out of fear. It would cross a red line without knowing it. For nearly 50 years, the U.S. has maintained a policy of strategic ambiguity towards Taiwan. By refusing to commit to defending the island, Washington has deterred Taipei from declaring independence. At the same time, suggesting it could defend Taiwan has deterred China from acting more aggressively against the island. I'm not quite sure that this, bit of strategic ambiguity is going to work well. I just find it really interesting that the administration is saying that, hey, well, the strategic ambiguity towards Taiwan is being abandoned, as Biden has now said 4 times since taking office that the U.S. would go to war with Taipei. President Vladimir Putin warned on Monday that he could order a nuclear strike to defend Russian territory. Putin threats were, as Moscow was warning it could deploy nukes if the territorial integrity of our country is threatened. We will, without a doubt, deploy all available means to protect Russia. And then former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev appeared to extend this nuclear umbrella to Ukrainian territories Moscow plans to annex through the referendums. And he said in his statement something along the lines of, those will just be the security situation will be the same there. So we don't know if the U.S. issued another one of these bad channel threats to Russia after Putin made his statement kind of warning that we could be getting pretty close to nuclear war here. But we did get this statement from Antony Blinken after Putin's statement. This from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. Blinken says U.S. will continue to support Ukraine despite Putin's nuclear warning. Secretary of State Antony Blinken on Thursday signaled that there would be no change to the U.S. policy of supporting Ukraine despite warnings from Russia that they could use nuclear weapons to defend Russian territory. Speaking to the UN Security Council, Blinken said it was up to Putin to end the war and that the U.S. would continue supporting Ukraine because if Russia stops fighting, it ends the war. If Ukraine stops fighting, it ends Ukraine, he said. That's why we'll continue to support Ukraine as it defends itself and strengthen its hand to achieve a diplomatic solution on just terms at the negotiating table. Now, I think what Blinken is saying here is somewhat disingenuous because I think we've heard from the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, very clearly that the U.S. policy in Ukraine is to weaken Russia, and it's really not about what's best for Ukraine as Blinken is trying to present it here. A lot of people, including, Western analysts like Doug Bondow, are saying that the policy here is to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian. And the idea of that is, Ukraine is a weaker state than Russia. And so in a war of attrition, Ukraine will be depleted first. However, comparatively between Russia and America, Russia and NATO, Russia and the West, Russia will be weakened for, decades, if not centuries from this war, even if it does ultimately prevail and get whatever Putin, really does seek out of Ukraine. So Throughout the war, the Biden administration has said that it was arming Ukraine to help Kiev from gaining a stronger hand in negotiations, but the U.S. has shown no interest in pursuing a diplomatic solution. Blinken has only spoken with his Russian counterpart once since Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24th, and the conversation was focused on potential prisoner swap. Blinken also criticized Moscow for referendums on joining Russia that will be held in Russian-controlled areas of Ukraine. Russia's efforts to annex more Ukrainian territory is another dangerous escalation, as well as a repudiation of diplomacy. Addressing Russia's nuclear warnings, Blinken said the Security Council should send a clear message that these reckless nuclear threats must be stopped immediately. Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov also addressed the Security Council and made clear that Moscow views the U.S. and its allies as a party to the conflict. What's particularly cynical is the position of the states that are pumping Ukraine full of weapons and training their soldiers. Lavrov said Ukraine's Western backers want to wear down and weaken Russia. And all right, let's talk about these votes in the Donbass. Now, there are people who, I don't want to say like they're libertarians or a part of the anti-war movement, but they are certainly people who interact with, people in our camps who I think have been far too pro-referendum here. Now, look, after the situation in 2014 and Russia annexed the Crimean Peninsula and held a referendum, I think not only from that referendum, but from the actions of the people on the peninsula, we could kind of see that, the people there did want to join Russia. Now, holding this referendum in the middle of a war in Russian-controlled territory seems rather difficult to say that this is going to in any way actually represent the will of the people. It may be that it's 6 months from now, right? Like if tomorrow the war ended, in 6 months or a year from now, these people would all vote to join Russia because they see more opportunity by being under the Kremlin's umbrella versus being under Kiev's umbrella, especially as throughout this war, Zelensky has moved his government in increasingly authoritarian and anti-Russian ways. And so, that's entirely possible that ultimately the people of these regions do want to join Russia. However, if this is Russian occupied territory, my guess is most of the people who would vote against this have already left, and maybe they would want to return to their homes once this war ended. So, this is really problematic, but I think this is more of a military strategy and threats than actual Russia trying to legitimately annex this territory here. I don't think that this is going to get that legitimacy on the world stage that maybe people feel that the Crimean Peninsula annexation had, because even Western countries who observed that referendum found a lot of legitimacy to it. So this I wrote for antiwar.com. Kremlin, after referendums, new territory will be treated as Russia. The Kremlin says the security situation will drastically change in 4 areas of Russian-held Ukraine after a vote on joining Russia is complete next week. Moscow appears ready to annex several regions of Ukraine and defend it as it would the rest of Russia. On Friday, Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov confirmed to reporters that the new areas would be treated as Russian territory. On Monday, Russian President Vladimir Putin said it would defend its territory by all available means. Later in the week, former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev warned that any encroachment on Russian territory is a crime. And so, kind of see how we could link all of these statements together. It really does seem like Russia is saying that, hey, we are extending that, dedication to defending our territory. And they're not saying that, look, if there's any attack in Russian territory, they're going to immediately use nuclear weapons, but they are saying that they would use all the weapons they have to defend an attack on Russian territory, up to and including using nuclear weapons. And so, that nuclear threat is there. Russia organized referendums in Kherson and Zaporizhia and the Donbass republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. All four regions are expected to vote in favor of joining Russia. The elections will run through September 27th. The statements from Peskov and Medvedev suggest Moscow will welcome adding all the Ukrainian territory. In 2014, the Donbass republics attempted to join Russia but were rebuffed by the Kremlin. At that time, remember, Russia was committed to trying to follow the Minsk agreement, which would have saw Russia allow these regions to have autonomy, but still be a part of Ukraine rather than just joining Russia proper. But now we're seeing that Russia is just annexing this territory. So this is another way where it's really unfortunate that the Minsk agreement was essentially vacated by the Zelensky regime in Kiev earlier this year. And one of the things that I think really gets downplayed when we talk about why the war in Ukraine is going on. The statements from, Western states have denounced the elections as a sham and stated they would not recognize the results. On Friday, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said the alliance would respond to referendums by providing more aid to our Ukraine. Our answer, NATO's answer, is to step up the support, Stoltenberg told CNN. He continued, the best way to end this war is to strengthen the Ukrainians on the battlefield further so they can, at some stage, sit down and reach a solution which is acceptable for Ukraine and preserves Ukrainian sovereignty, independent nation in Europe. Meanwhile, Medvedev believes Russia absorbing the territory will be a transformative event. The Donbass joining Russia would make the geopolitical transformation of the world become irreversible, he said. And everybody always overstates this, but I do think there are going to be a lot of things that, depending on how they play out in Ukraine, will probably impact how, states act maybe going forward here, particularly, I don't want to say China and Taiwan or anything like that, but that other states can draw red lines shortly outside of their own territory against the U.S. would be interesting to see happen here. I guess the only other thing I really wanted to mention on all of this is that rather than responding to this by in any way suggesting they're going to acknowledge the new reality on the ground, that they're just going to double down and provide more weapons to Ukraine is really concerning here. And hopefully at some point some kind of debate will go up. I saw more conservative leaning groups like the Heritage Foundation are now suggesting that we shouldn't provide more aid to Ukraine, or at least not if the Europeans aren't providing more. And so there are some, positives here that maybe we're going to get more debate. However, I think that, the momentum is pretty big. So hopefully they don't push the nuclear issue here, because I think Russia is probably making a very serious threat, but it really looks like they're going to push forward in Ukraine, even though Russia is saying that, this is now our territory and we're going to defend it like we would the rest of our territory. This last article from on Russia from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com, this is interesting, where we're starting to see a little bit of that fracturing, this time in Europe. The European Union leadership wants to issue new sanctions against Russia to respond to planned referendums on joining those territories joining Russia in Russian-controlled Ukraine, but the EU has struggled to reach a consensus. The issue is sanctions are backfiring and energy prices are skyrocketing, so they're not sure if they want to go through it. And Hungary and other countries are starting to suggest, they might not want to go through with more of this. So 2 more articles I have here. This one I wrote with Connor Freeman for the Libertarian Institute, titled South Korean President Caught on Hot Mic calling U.S. legislators effers as a U.S. aircraft carrier made a port call in South Korea. So while in the UN General Assembly, while in New York for the UN General Assembly. I think this was actually at a different event. The South Korean president Yoon Suk Yeol was caught on hot mic insulting President Joe Biden and U.S. legislators on Wednesday. Yoon referred to members of Congress as effers. He actually said the word. The statement comes after the U.S. pledged $6 billion in humanitarian aid and deployed an American aircraft carrier to South Korea. Yoon's hot mic remarks were caught at the Global Fund. How could Biden not lose face if these effers do not pass it in Congress? He said prior to his insulting remarks, Biden pledged up to $6 million to fight HIV, $6 billion to fight HIV and tuberculosis. The aid would need the approval of Congress. And so he was saying the effers in Congress would be the legislators, maybe like the Republicans. I don't know. So this is crazy. It ends up trending, of course, but nobody really, ever bothers to say like, hey, let's question the relationship or anything here. It's just, this is a gaffe and maybe people will be upset. But Yoon's viral gaffe comes as Washington and Seoul have increased military ties over the past several months. Yoon, who took office in May, as well as Biden, have broken with their predecessors who sought diplomacy with North Korea. In the latest exhibition of growing military ties, the U.S. aircraft carrier USS Ronald Reagan visited South Korea. The port calls the first for an American aircraft carrier in South Korea since 2018. The visit is meant as a show of force to Pyongyang and is exemplary of the Biden administration's strategy to deploy more nuclear-capable assets to Seoul. The U.S. and South Korea recently conducted their first live-fire war games in over 5 years at a NATO summit in May. Washington and Tokyo and Seoul signed a trilateral agreement to increase military drills. North Korea views the increased military ties between the U.S. and South Korea as a growing threat. Pyongyang has carried out a record number of missile tests this year, including the first intercontinental ballistic test in several years. The heightened tensions on the Korean peninsula come after a period of warming relations. American President Donald Trump and South Korean President Moon Jae-in, along with North Korean Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un, held several summits and drastically cut back on militarism. During this period, North and South Korea destroyed border posts along the demilitarized zone. Washington ended live-fire military drills in the region, and Pyongyang froze its missile program for several years. However, the new approach shared by both Biden and Yoon has made confrontation more likely and diplomacy nearly impossible. Kim recently announced a new North Korean nuclear policy that says it cannot give up its nuclear weapons. Meanwhile, Washington maintains Pyongyang's denuclearization is a precondition to any agreement. All right, last article here today. Just want to not leave out Somalia because so often, what happens in Africa does get left out. And Dave DeCamp has a story here from antiwar.com last week. U.S. bombs Somalia, says 27 al-Shabaab fighters killed. The U.S. launched an airstrike in Somalia on September 18th. U.S. AFRICOM said on Wednesday the Biden administration continues to escalate its war against al-Shabaab. According to AFRICOM, the strike was done in support of the Mogadishu-based government and killed 27 al-Shabaab fighters. AFRICOM claimed no civilians were killed in the strikes, but the Pentagon is notorious for undercounting civilian casualties, especially in Moscow, where its observations are shrouded in secrecy. And I guess maybe that's the only place I would have elaborated if I were Dave. It's not necessarily secrecy, it's just nobody cares. And so unless somebody from the Western press happens to go to the village that the strike was carried out in and ask people like, hey, who was killed there, then the military just gets to label them as al-Shabaab militants. Everybody in the U.S. goes, good job, we got more al-Qaeda, and didn't realize, that kids, old men, or something like that were really the victims here. And so, but great write-up here by Dave DeCamp. I am having him on the show this week, so very excited about that. Should have an extra show for everybody this week. I know this show's a little bit on the shorter side, but this is where I'm going to wrap it up today. So please check out the Libertarian Institute, antiwar.com, and Paloma Verde, CBD.com, promo code PEACE. Catch you guys later in the week.